The next thing that we're going to be adding to our project is we're going to go ahead and add a title to the beginning portion of our project. We'll be building out a more complex title, and we'll be using the Essential Graphics pane to manage it. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new item. So I'll start off by creating a new layer. I'm going to begin by creating a rectangle. This is going to place a rectangle onto my screen. Then I'll go ahead and specify the settings. I want it to have no fill. I'm going to give it a white stroke, and the stroke width can be 3. I'm not going to use a shadow or anything else. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add a new text layer. This is going to go ahead and say sharks. I'm going to select the text, and I'll go ahead and specify the font family. For this, I'll use Nonito Black. I'm going to make the text faux bold and all caps. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to select both of these layers, the shape and the text, and we'll use the Align panel to center them. As you can see, my shape does not fit around the text. So I'm going to switch back to my selection tool, and then we'll simply select the shape and we'll stretch this out so that it fits around the text. Once again, I'm going to select both of these layers, and I'll just go ahead and align them to vertically and horizontal centers. The next thing that I want to show you is you can go ahead and make your elements work in a responsive mode. What we're going to do is we're going to grab the rectangle and we're going to use the responsive design feature to pin this to the shark text. With the shape selected, I'm going to use pin to, and I'll select sharks. Then I'll go ahead and select which edge of the parent layer should be used for pinning. And I'm going to want to pin all of the edges. Nothing is going to visibly change on our screen, but if we go ahead and change what the text says, so if we write SoCal Sharks, you can see how not only does the text increase, but the box also increases, and it will scale based on what we write. This is a great feature because it allows you to be more flexible, especially if you might want to reuse this later on. I always like to pin my elements so that they work responsively. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a couple more elements. I'll go ahead and I'll add another shape. This is going to be a rectangle, and for this rectangle, we're going to resize this, and then we're going to move it so that it lines up with the left edge of the original shape. I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to add a fill color. So we'll go ahead and add white for our fill color. I'm going to click OK. And ultimately, what I would like to have happen is I would like this particular shape to not have quite so much opacity. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the opacity slider and change the opacity to be around 75%. Now that we have this in place, I'm going to bring in a custom graphic. In order to bring in a custom graphic, we're going to click our new layer and we'll choose from file. Now what I'll do is I'll browse my computer, find the graphic that I want, and click import. This is going to import the file and place it into my document. Now all I need to do is resize this down, and then we'll go ahead and place it on our square. I'm going to select the shape layer and the logo, and I'll use the alignment tools to align them to the center. This is going to create something like this. Ultimately, I'm going to have this graphic appear in the lower left-hand corner of my screen. This is going to be the title of my project, and this is where I want it to reside. We are going to add some animation and some effects to make it a little bit more visually interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and stretch out the time that the title appears so that it covers the first 10 seconds of my project, which is where I'm showing all of these still images. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my playback head 1 second in. So I'll type 1 period to easily get to 1 second. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set keyframes. With this element selected, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a keyframe for motion and for opacity. Let's do position and scale and opacity. Now I'll move back to the beginning of my project, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to have the item be positioned more in the center of the screen. We're going to have it be quite a bit smaller, and we're going to bring the opacity down to 0. If we play now, you'll see that this is going to scale, fade, and move during the first second of playback. Great. The next thing that I'll do is I'll go back into the Essential Graphics pane, and we're going to add some effects. So what I want to have happen here is I want to have a little bit of blurring. Let's go to our effect bin. Let's search for blur, and we'll go ahead and use the directional blur. So I'm going to add this to this particular element. As soon as I do, you can see that it gets added into the stack right here. The next thing that we'll do is we'll go ahead and set some keyframes. So once again, I'm going to move my playback head back to the beginning of the second clip. And this is where we'll set the keyframing for the blur effect. So I'm going to go ahead and find the directional blur. We're going to go ahead and we're going to add keyframes for both direction and blur length. Then I'll move the playback head back to the beginning of the second clip so that I can see what I'm doing. And if we go ahead and increase the direction, this is going to control the direction of the blur and the blur length. So as I increase the blur length, if I switch the direction around, you can see how it's going to make the direction look a little bit different. So I want the direction to be at 90 degrees, and we'll have the blur length be around 30. Then I'm going to grab both of these two keyframes that we just made and move them to the very beginning of the project. Let's take a look at what this looks like now. As you can see, there's all sorts of ways in which you can customize any sort of text or even graphical-based elements that you want to use within your project. The final thing that we're going to do is we're going to save this out as a template in case we want to use this later on in our project or even in another project. In order to save any sort of graphics that you've made as a template, you'll find it in the timeline, you'll right-click, and you're going to choose Export as Motion Graphics Template. Then it's going to export the file out. I usually keep my templates in the template folder. I'm going to give this a title of Logo Box Text Box. I'm going to include a video thumbnail, and I'll go ahead and check Warn Me if this motion graphics template uses fonts that are not available on Adobe fonts, and warn me if this motion graphics uses any effects that are not included within Premiere Pro. You can also add keywords so that you can make searching your template files easier, but for our purposes this is fine. I'll click OK, and you can see that because I'm using a particular font that is not part of the Adobe fonts, it's going to give me a warning. I'll click OK. It's going to export to the motion graphics templates. And now if I go to some other location within my project and decide that I want to use that exact same title, I can go to Browse. I'll click Local Templates folder. And if we scroll down, you'll see that here's the template that we created. So now if I want to use this later on, all I have to do is drag it out to my project. I can resize it to be any size that I want, and I can go ahead and change what the text says. So in this case, if I want this to say Taupe Shark, I would select the text, I would click on this, and I could say Taupe Shark. Because we went ahead and made this responsive, all of the rest of the elements are going to scale up as necessary. The final thing that I'm going to do in this particular instance is I'm going to scale the entire thing down. In order to scale the entire thing down, I'm going to select the item in the timeline. We'll go to the vector motion area, and I can simply scale down. So I want this to be quite a bit smaller in this particular instance. I'll scale it to 50%, then I'll select everything, and we'll move it to the lower left-hand corner. If we go ahead and play this section, you'll see that it's going to be reminiscent of what we had before, but it's just going to be a little bit smaller. Days, and you can really see some amazing wildlife. This is a great way to repurpose elements that you've created and be able to easily use them within your projects, keeping everything consistent and keeping your brand on target.